Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming back today to continue our discussion about education of the deaf in America. And we've talked already on Monday about oralism and the failures that were encountered with oralism, and also the philosophy of total communication and all of the research that showed that although the philosophy was a good one, it didn't always transpire into the real world practice. And so we talked about the failures of total communication as well. Today, we're going to talk about bi-bi, or bilingual bicultural, and that model of deaf education. The introduction of bi-bi came about because of two reasons: the failures of oralism and total communication, and also the deaf community itself. There was a growing body of evidence, linguistic research, that pointed to the failures of oralism and total communication. And it was obvious that the deaf kids weren't being successful in their academic endeavors. The research began to show that in order for a deaf child's cognitive development to really take place, that they first had to be given a language that was fully accessible. And so neither oralism nor total communication obtained that goal. So, let's talk about the deaf community, because we've already talked about oralism and TC. And so let's talk about what was happening in the deaf community. In the 70s, remember that was when TC was coming on the scene. In the 70s, the deaf community, and especially in the 80s, began to advocate for themselves. They wanted to have the right to pass down the language and the culture of their own, and they wanted to be a part of the decisions that were being made in the realm of education for deaf kids. There were deaf television shows that were being produced. KRON TV in San Francisco and WTOP in Washington, D.C. both had deaf reporters. They were on TV like Jerry Springer, like Oprah, and it was a television show that was produced, and the audience was deaf people. And the language medium of these TV shows was ASL. They talked about grassroots issues that were important to the deaf community, and they often talked about hot topics and open the discussion throughout the country on these hot topics. And so they were very popular, and often language choice and deaf education was a topic that you would see discussed on these TV shows. That was in the 1970s. The research started to point out something called ESL, or English as a Second Language, that there may be something in the body of research that was already present on ESL and how to educate children bilingually, and how that perhaps would apply in deaf education. And so that was the very beginnings of ESL being applied to deaf ed. And we look again to Europe to see what they're doing. And in Sweden, for years and years, deaf adults and parents of deaf children advocated in Parliament to have bilingualism for their children. And in 1981, Sweden passed a law indicating that they agreed and they thought it was important for deaf children to be bilingual so that they could be successful in society, in school, in their families. And so the United States and deaf people were watching and seeing this transpire, and then it was being talked about on the deaf TV shows. And educators and linguists started down the road to find evidence and more research about ESL and how it would apply to deaf kids. You all know about the Deaf President Now protest at Gallaudet, so I'm not going to go into that very much in depth. But just know that this was happening in 1988, which was in the midst of all of the research that was beginning to come about ESL in the classroom. And so at this time, that was a student-led protest, right? But there were faculty and staff of Gallaudet, the students and alumni that were all in support of this. And so it really was more than just the students at Gallaudet. It became a wider deaf community issue. And it became the beginning of a self-determination for the deaf in America, where they said, you know what, it's our education, and we want to be a part of the decisions that are being made about the education for deaf kids that are coming. And so it was a newfound self-determination for the deaf world, especially here in the U.S., and it piggybacks on what was happening in Sweden. A deaf president at Gallaudet, an all-deaf university, became a symbol of this self-determination. And it began a season of awareness where not only was the deaf community talking about these issues in their own community, but it became wider. Deaf people started to talk to hearing people about their culture and about their language. And so it really was an awakening in the deaf community. In 1994, we talked about this a little bit yesterday about the NAD. The NAD was established about 100 years prior to this proclamation, but in 1994, the NAD had a position paper where they came out in support of bilingualism for deaf children. They said, we absolutely support the idea that deaf children should have a right to ASL and to be educated bilingually. And so 1994, so you can see we're not very far past that, about 20 years past this proclamation. Let me check and make sure I've given you everything that I wanted to say. So let's talk more in depth about bye-bye. What is bilingual biculturalism? In that model itself, what does it encompass? And it is making a foundation, a linguistic and a cognitive foundation in ASL first. And so a deaf child is given linguistic input in ASL so that their mind, so that their cognition can develop first in ASL. And then you follow that by education in the second language or the spoken language, and often that was in written text. Okay, so that's the impetus, that's the idea behind bye-bye. When bye-bye was first introduced, Johnson talks about how important parental involvement is to this model. He talked about support groups and foster grandparents so that when a family had a deaf child, a deaf couple would come alongside that family and act as a foster grandparent role model. And so the parent involvement was a big deal in the bye-bye model. They talked about having weekend immersion experiences so that the family could become a part of the deaf community. They talked about summer camps where the whole family would go to summer camp and be surrounded by the deaf community. And so part of the bye-bye model, it involves parental willingness to be a part of this in order for it to work. And they really are adopted into the culture. And bye-bye, by its nature, respects both ASL and English. So the deaf child and the family of the deaf child becomes a part of the deaf community, and so ASL is respected. And as well, the deaf child becomes a part of the hearing world because their parents are hearing, their extended family is probably hearing. And so in the bye-bye model, both cultures are respected and honored, and both languages are valued. So it's not that suddenly we have a switch and we're going to go ASL only and we're not going to recognize English or that there's benefit to being able to even speak. It's not that at all. It's that both languages are upheld and respected. Dual membership, in other words. In the mid-90s, there were 7 residential schools for the deaf in the United States. So I'm going to talk more about residential schools and specifically programs that said we are bye-bye. I'm going to talk more about that in the research that goes along with that. But first, let's talk about why you would ever have this idea of bye-bye. ASL is natural for deaf children in the U.S. If you take a deaf child, and this child is born to deaf parents who use ASL, this child will learn ASL in their environment just because they're there. It's absorbed. your first language, your native language, was absorbed. When you were a baby and you were born into some kind of linguistic environment. And in your homes, it was probably spoken English. You just absorbed that language because you were in that environment. And it was not something that was taught to you. Your parents modeled things, I'm sure, but it was not specifically taught to you. You just absorbed your language because you were part of that environment. Deaf kids are no different when they have ASL using deaf parents. They absorb the linguistic environment and it becomes a part of who they are. And when they have competence in this first language, it leads to a transfer to a second language, which in the AS we talk about English, whether it be written or also could be spoken. But the premise here is that if you give a fully intact linguistic language to a deaf child, ASL, that will transfer over to a second language. So I'll talk more about that. Before I talk about that, though, I want to talk about Piaget. If you've taken psychology classes here, you've probably heard of Piaget, or maybe in your educational classes if you take any of those. Piaget was a psychologist and he talked a lot about language development in general. And in 1955, he talked about mime and gesture and how mime and gesture is language emotion, okay? And he talked about that mime and gesture is the real language of a social child. And so a child, in their social being, as a little person trying to communicate, they use gesture and mime. It's natural. And Daniels in 1993 went on to say, you know, if the language of a child is gesture and motion, and a language of motion, then ASL fits the bill, right? It's a natural language for kids. And he says, ASL, which is a language indeed, is a language in movement. And it may well provide a more natural mode for language acquisition and development in children. Okay, I think I jumped ahead of my slides when I was talking about language and how it's absorbed, because that really goes with this. We talked about last week or the week before about Nicaraguan Sign Language, and you know how much I love to talk about Nicaraguan Sign Language, so I'm going to bring it up again. When these children were brought together, right, what happened? They rejected the language that was trying to be taught to them by their hearing teachers, right? They rejected that. And they turned to one another and they communicated. But the language that they chose to use to communicate with each other was sign language. They figured out some way to communicate with each other, and it was in sign. And so Bye-Bye stands on this premise that sign language is natural language for deaf kids, for deaf people in general. Mayberry in 2002 put it this way: your native language is developed deep within your cerebral cortex because of the natural linguistic input of your parents. Okay, so your native language was acquired effortlessly. And you acquired it and it went somewhere deep within your cerebral cortex. And that's where your native language resides. And so for deaf kids, that is ASL if they're given the opportunity for it to develop. English, on the other hand, is not acquired effortlessly. It is not acquired simply by being in the linguistic environment of spoken English because they don't have full access to spoken English. If they have a little residual hearing, they might have some access to that auditory input in that linguistic environment, but not full. It's not a fully accessible medium, right? It's not effortlessly acquired. In fact, just the opposite. For a deaf child, learning English is something that is taught and learned one element at a time, and it requires much time. Now, let's talk about ASL and how it develops. Piaget talked about, in general, how language develops. And it's no surprise if ASL is an intact linguistic environment that it too goes through predictable stages of development. Okay? And so here on this slide, you can see those stages of development. Deaf babies in an ASL home with parents who are using a fully intact ASL will babble right off the bat. They'll babble. Earlier than hearing kids will babble in speech. Okay, we'll talk about that a little bit later. After the babbling stage, they start to use one sign. One word is what it says on this slide. So they'll start to use one sign at a time. That's followed by putting two signs together. And it becomes more and more morphologically complex. All of those things that you studied this semester, talking about morphology, that's what the child is learning. And with time, they become more and more and more complex, which completely mirrors spoken language and how it develops. Notice the last point. They master their ASL about the age of 5 or 6. Okay? Think about school age. When do kids come to school? About 5 or 6, right? So by the time you got to school, your native language was intact, and you started to learn about, academic things. First it was colors and shapes and whatnot. But your language, your native language, was intact when you were 5 or 6 years old. There's no difference between deaf kids of deaf parents who use ASL. Their language is intact at about 5 or 6 years of age. Okay? But if you miss this window, the effects of that are very detrimental. So let's talk about that a little bit. It's not just a matter of exposure to sign language. It's about when the exposure takes place. The later the exposure to ASL, the worse the acquisition is. The earlier the exposure, the better the acquisition is. Okay? So the older a child is when the child starts to learn ASL or comes in an environment where ASL is used, the older that child is, the more detriments to their morphology and their syntax that you can identify. Research has shown significant deficits in specific areas. Memory and comprehension, for example, came to play. And it didn't matter if the sentence was in an ASL story, a full-blown ASL story, or if the story was some kind of version of Pidgin Sign English or PSE, or even if they simplified the ASL and used elements of English that are often used between deaf and hearing people, even if the language was reduced like that, there were still significant deficits in comprehension shown in the research. Now, if you'll notice the second point up there, it says that there's a significant pivot point at 6 years of age. That seems to be the point where it makes a huge difference. That if the exposure happens prior to 6, good things happen. If exposure happens after the age of 6, then bad things happen. And you can see significant detriments in the grammatical structure and comprehension for these kids. So, back to bye-bye, it's important that these kids have a full linguistic ASL environment way before they ever get to school, right? We need to do something to change that these kids are getting to school without any kind of language exposure prior to that, because that window is closing. That pivot point is passing. Oftentimes, exposure to ASL doesn't even happen until after the child has failed at spoken English. And so they go to school, and they try to do what you do at school, and they try to talk, and they try to do what their parents are wanting them to do, and they try to do what their teachers are asking of them, and they fail. And then they get exposed to sign or ASL. Okay? And remember that pivot point, that junction is at 6. And so when does that decision of, oh, okay, this isn't working, when does that happen? Usually not at 6, right? The last point up here talks about adults. It talks about ASL users who are adults who've used ASL for years, that when they were first exposed to sign after the age of 6, you can still see these effects in their day-to-day communication. So these deaf folks use ASL every day, have known it for years, and still, if you do research on them, they will still show detriments in their ASL. And so you can imagine how that affects their academic endeavors. You know, if their language at 6 is not intact, and then they try to add history and science and math on top of an incomplete linguistic foundation or a native language, you're not going to get very far. And so let's talk about some specific research that shows this. Okay. Mayberry in 2002 studied 2 groups of deaf adults. They took tests of nonverbal intelligence, and they were shown to have equal levels of nonverbal intelligence. And there were 2 groups. There were first language learners and second language learners. And so let's talk about the first language learners, okay? So these folks were deaf, and they learned and had exposure to sign between the ages of 9 and 13, I think it is, okay? That group that didn't get exposed to sign until 9 to 13 showed significant detriments in their ASL comprehension. Okay, so even if they used it every day in communicating with other people, they still showed significant detriments in their ASL comprehension. But if you compare that, sorry, Angela, you probably can't see. If you compare that to deaf folks who lost their hearing later, okay, so they had infections or something caused them to lose their hearing later. They were a hearing person first. They had a first language. It was English, was spoken English, and then they contracted an infection and they lost their hearing. And their exposure to sign language was between the ages of 9 and 11, which is about the same time, right? The same time the exposure happened for the other deaf folks. But they didn't show detriments like the first group. They showed near native levels of ASL comprehension.